The parking lot was almost empty, just a few cars, a rusted shopping cart rolling slowly in the wind. And
The parking lot was almost empty. Just a few cars. A rusted shopping cart rolling slowly in the wind. An elderly woman stepped out of the small grocery store. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker. She walked carefully, holding one small paper bag. Bread, milk, tea. Her shoes moved slow across the cracked pavement. A black sedan rolled into the lot. Too smooth, too quiet. It stopped beside her. Two men stepped out. Young, clean clothes. Friendly smiles that felt rehearsed. "Ma'am," the taller one said. Eleanor stopped walking. "Yes." The second man held up a plastic badge too quickly to read. "We're with the City Utilities Department." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh." The tall man nodded. "There's been a billing error on your electricity account." Eleanor blinked. "A mistake?" "Yes, ma'am. Looks like you overpaid." The second man leaned closer. "You're owed a refund." Eleanor gripped her grocery bag tighter. "Well, that's nice of you boys to tell me." "Of course," the tall man said smoothly. "But there's one small problem." "What's that?" "We need to verify some information inside your home." Eleanor paused. A long pause. The wind moved her gray hair slightly. Then she smiled. "Well, all right." The two men exchanged a quick glance. Predators recognizing easy prey. But Eleanor noticed the glance. And she noticed something else. Across the street, a police cruiser slowly drove past, and the taller man suddenly whispered to his partner, "Make it quick." Eleanor opened her front door and stepped inside. The men followed. None of them noticed a tiny red recording light blinking inside her purse. The grocery store bell rang softly as the door opened. Eleanor Whitaker stepped outside. The afternoon sun warmed the quiet street. She held a small paper bag close to her chest. Bread, milk, tea. Not much. Just enough for one person. Her steps were slow but steady. The parking lot was almost empty. One pickup truck, two parked sedans, and a black car that just pulled in. Inside the car, two men watched her. Kyle leaned forward. "There she is." Derek squinted through the windshield. "The old lady?" Kyle nodded. "Lives alone. House on Maple Street." "You sure?" "Positive." Derek studied her carefully. Gray hair, thin frame, walking slowly. "Yeah," he said. "She'll work." Kyle smiled. "Easy money." They stepped out of the car. Eleanor reached the sidewalk. "Ma'am," Derek called. She turned slowly. Her eyes moved carefully over both men. "Yes." Kyle pulled out a plastic badge. He flashed it quickly. "City Utilities Department." Eleanor blinked. "Oh." Derek stepped closer. "There's been a billing mistake with your electricity account." "A mistake?" "Yes, ma'am." Kyle nodded quickly. "Looks like you overpaid." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Well, that's surprising." Derek smiled. "Happens more than you'd think." Kyle added smoothly, "You're owed a refund." Eleanor looked down at her grocery bag. "Well, that's very nice." Derek glanced toward her house down the street. "We just need to verify a few details inside." "Oh." "Won't take long," Kyle said. "Just paperwork." Eleanor hesitated. Only for a moment. Then she nodded. "Well, I suppose that's all right." Kyle and Derek exchanged a quick glance. Perfect. They walked together toward her small house. Kyle whispered under his breath, "Told you." Derek chuckled quietly. "Easiest job this week." Eleanor unlocked the front door. The house smelled faintly like tea and old books. Simple furniture. Clean floors. A quiet place. Kyle stepped inside first. Derek followed. Eleanor closed the door behind them. Kyle looked around the living room. "Nice place." "Thank you," Eleanor said. Derek walked slowly toward a hallway. "Where do you usually keep your financial paperwork?" "Oh," Eleanor said softly. "In the study." Kyle turned toward her. "And your bank statements?" "In there, too." Derek opened a drawer. "Nothing important." Kyle's smile slowly faded. He looked at Derek. Derek nodded slightly. The polite act ended instantly. Kyle's voice hardened. "All right, lady." Eleanor blinked. Yes. Let's skip the games. Derek shut the drawer loudly. Where's the cash? Eleanor frowned. I'm sorry. Kyle stepped closer. Your savings. I don't understand. Derek walked back into the room. Don't play dumb. Kyle pointed toward the hallway. We know you've got money here. Eleanor's voice stayed calm. I really don't know what you're talking about. Kyle laughed once. Cold. You will. Derek walked to the front door. Then he turned the lock. The deadbolt slid shut with a sharp metallic click. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Eleanor slowly looked at the locked door. Kyle crossed his arms. Now, he said, let's start over. The deadbolt clicked into place. The sound hung in the air. Eleanor looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked back at the two men. Kyle leaned against the wall. His friendly smile was gone now. All right, he said slowly. Let's stop pretending. Eleanor held her grocery bag closer. I'm not sure what you mean. Derek walked around the living room. He opened a cabinet. Nothing. He shut it harder than needed. You know exactly what we mean, he said. Kyle nodded toward Eleanor. You live alone, right? Eleanor didn't answer. Kyle stepped closer. Let me guess. Husband passed away. A pause. Eleanor nodded once. Yes. Kyle shrugged. Thought so. Derek walked toward a small desk near the window. He opened the top drawer. Papers. Old letters. Nothing useful. He sighed. Where do you keep your savings? Eleanor's hands tightened slightly around the bag. I don't keep cash in the house. Kyle laughed. Sure you don't. Derek closed the drawer slowly. We're not here to hurt you, he said. Not if you cooperate. Eleanor looked at him carefully. Cooperate with what? Kyle spoke before Derek could answer, with a simple question. He leaned forward. Where is your money? Eleanor's voice stayed soft. I told you, I don't keep money here. Derek walked closer. His boots were heavy on the floor. You people always say that. Eleanor blinked. People? Kyle waved his hand. Old folks. Retired folks. Derek added quietly, folks who don't trust banks. Eleanor didn't respond. Kyle watched her closely. You've lived here a long time? Yes. Neighborhood seems quiet. It usually is. Kyle looked toward Derek. Perfect kind of place. Derek nodded. No neighbors watching. Eleanor spoke gently. Why are you doing this? Kyle tilted his head. Doing what? This. The room went quiet. Derek folded his arms. Because it works. Kyle grinned. Simple as that. Eleanor studied their faces. You've done this before. Kyle chuckled. What do you think? Derek pointed toward the hallway. Checked the bedroom. Kyle walked down the hall. A door opened. Closet doors slid. Drawers opened. Eleanor listened quietly. Derek stayed in the living room, watching her, studying her. You're calm, he said. I'm confused. Most people cry by now. Eleanor tilted her head. I don't see the point in crying. Derek narrowed his eyes. You think this is funny? No. Then why aren't you scared? Eleanor looked down briefly, then back up. I suppose I've lived long enough to know fear doesn't help. Derek stared at her for a moment. Then Kyle shouted from the bedroom. Nothing in here. He walked back into the living room, frustration on his face. Closet's empty. Derek frowned. What about the dresser? Just clothes. Kyle looked at Eleanor again. You hiding it somewhere clever? Eleanor said nothing. Kyle walked toward her slowly. Look, we can do this the easy way. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And the hard way? Kyle smiled. The hard way takes longer. Derek added, and you won't enjoy it. Eleanor's eyes moved between them. Gentlemen? Kyle interrupted her. Don't call us that. The word came out sharp. Derek rubbed his chin. There's always something. Kyle nodded. Always. He pointed toward the kitchen. Check in there. Derek walked toward the kitchen doorway. Cabinets opened. Pots clanged. Drawers slid. Eleanor stood very still. Kyle circled the room slowly. You know what I think? He said. What? Eleanor asked. I think you're lying. I'm not. Kyle stopped walking. You don't seem worried about two strangers in your house. Eleanor's voice stayed even. You told me you worked for the city. Kyle smirked. Yeah. Derek returned from the kitchen. Nothing. Kyle sighed loudly. This is getting annoying. Derek leaned against the wall. She's hiding it. Kyle nodded. Definitely. Eleanor spoke quietly. Why would I keep cash in my house? Kyle laughed again. Because people like you always do. Eleanor watched them carefully. And what kind of people is that? Kyle answered instantly. Old people who don't trust anyone. The room fell silent again. Derek pushed himself off the wall. Check the study. Kyle pointed down the hall. Last room. Derek walked slowly toward it. The door creaked open. He stepped inside. Papers shuffled. A drawer slid open. Kyle stayed in the living room with Eleanor, watching her. You know, he said, you're a strange lady. How so? You're asking a lot of questions. Eleanor gave a small smile. I've always been curious. Kyle crossed his arms. Curiosity can get people into trouble. Eleanor's eyes stayed steady. So can greed. Kyle's smile disappeared. At that moment, Derek returned from the hallway. His expression had changed. Something in his face had hardened. He looked directly at Eleanor. Long, carefully. Then he asked slowly, Lady, why are you asking so many questions? The room went completely still. The room went still. Eleanor met Derek's eyes. Calm. Too calm. Kyle looked between them. What do you mean? He asked. Derek didn't answer right away. He kept staring at Eleanor. She's been doing it since we walked in, he said finally. Kyle frowned. Doing what? Asking questions. Kyle shrugged. Old people talk a lot. Derek shook his head. No. His eyes stayed on Eleanor. Not like this. Eleanor adjusted the grocery bag in her hands. Am I not allowed to ask questions in my own house? Kyle smirked. Depends on the question. Eleanor nodded slowly. I was only curious. Curious about what? Derek asked. About you. Kyle laughed once. That's flattering. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. You said you work for the utilities department. Yeah, Kyle said. And yet you're asking about cash. Kyle rolled his eyes. Lady, drop it. Eleanor's voice stayed soft. I just find it interesting. Derek stepped closer. Interesting how? Eleanor looked from one man to the other. You didn't bring paperwork. Kyle shrugged. Didn't need it. You didn't bring a company vehicle either. Kyle's smile faded slightly. So, Eleanor continued. And when you showed your badge, Derek's jaw tightened. What about it? You held it too fast for me to read. Kyle sighed loudly. Okay, I'm getting tired of this. He stepped closer to Eleanor. Let's keep things simple. Eleanor nodded. All right. Where's the money? I told you already. There's always money. Not here. Kyle turned toward Derek. You see what I mean? Derek nodded slowly. Yeah. Kyle leaned closer to Eleanor. You know what the funny part is? What? We've done this a lot. Eleanor watched him quietly. Kyle continued. People like you are predictable. People like me? Quiet neighborhoods. Retirement savings. Cash hidden in the house. Derek added, under mattresses, in safes, inside books. Kyle grinned, sometimes taped under drawers. Eleanor said nothing. Kyle folded his arms. You'd be surprised how much people hide. Derek walked slowly across the room again. You're actually one of the calmer ones. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. One of... Kyle chuckled. Oh, yeah. Derek nodded. We hit 3 houses last month. Kyle corrected him. 4. Derek shrugged. Right, 4. Eleanor's voice stayed quiet. And they all let you inside? Kyle smiled proudly. Most people trust a badge. Derek added, in a confident voice. Eleanor studied their faces. And what happens to them? Kyle tilted his head. What do you think? Eleanor didn't answer. Derek spoke flatly. They lose some money. Kyle shrugged. Sometimes a lot. And that doesn't bother you? Kyle laughed again. Why would it? Eleanor held his gaze. Because they're vulnerable. Kyle waved his hand dismissively. Everyone's vulnerable. Derek nodded. That's the world. Eleanor asked softly, how much have you taken? Kyle looked at Derek. Derek shrugged, hard to keep track. Kyle thought for a moment. Maybe 60,000? Derek corrected him. Closer to 80. Kyle nodded. Yeah, that sounds right. Eleanor went quiet. Kyle studied her face again. See? Now you look worried. Eleanor spoke slowly. You're very open about your crimes. Kyle smirked. Who are you going to tell? Derek suddenly raised a hand. Hold on. Kyle looked at him. What? Derek stepped closer to Eleanor again. Slowly, carefully, his eyes narrowed. You're doing it again. Eleanor blinked. Doing what? Fishing. Kyle frowned. What are you talking about? Derek didn't look away from Eleanor. She keeps steering the conversation. Kyle laughed. Dude, relax. But Derek's voice was quiet. Serious. No, something's off. Kyle turned back toward Eleanor. Lady, are you trying to stall us? Eleanor's expression stayed calm. I don't know what you mean. Derek stepped even closer now, only a few feet away. You're asking too many questions. Eleanor tilted her head. And that worries you? Kyle rolled his eyes. It doesn't worry me. But Derek didn't move. His voice dropped slightly. Lady, he looked directly into her eyes. Why are you asking so many questions? Eleanor was silent for a moment. Then she gave a small smile, the kind that didn't quite match the situation. And that was the moment Derek felt it. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He turned toward Kyle. Check her purse. Kyle frowned. What? Just do it. Kyle looked back at Eleanor. Her purse rested on the small table beside her. He reached toward it. Eleanor's voice came out calm. You shouldn't touch that. Kyle froze for a moment. Then he smirked. Oh! Derek's eyes narrowed. Kyle grabbed the purse, and the small red light inside it kept blinking. Kyle's fingers tightened around the purse. The room went quiet again. Eleanor stood still. Too still. Derek watched her face carefully. Open it, he said. Kyle turned the purse slowly in his hands. Relax, he muttered. It's just a purse. Eleanor's voice was calm. You really shouldn't do that. Kyle smirked. Why not? Eleanor didn't answer. Derek stepped closer. Because what? Kyle unzipped the purse halfway. Then he paused. Phone, he said. He pulled it out. An old smartphone. Cracked case. Nothing special. Kyle tossed it onto the couch. See, he said. Nothing. Derek still didn't look convinced. Keep checking. Kyle rolled his eyes. Man, you're getting paranoid. He reached back into the purse. Wallet, keys, lip balm, small notebook. Kyle held each item up as he pulled them out. Wow, he said sarcastically. Real exciting stuff. Derek watched Eleanor. Her expression hadn't changed. Not once. That bothered him. Keep going, he said. Kyle sighed. Fine. He turned the purse upside down. A few more things slid onto the table. A pen, loose coins, then something small and black dropped onto the wood surface. It landed with a quiet tap. Kyle frowned. What's that? Derek leaned closer. It looked like a small USB drive, but thicker, with a tiny blinking red light. Kyle picked it up. The light blinked again. Once. Twice. Derek's stomach tightened. What is it? Kyle asked. Derek spoke slowly. Looks like a recorder. Kyle blinked. A what? Eleanor's voice came quietly. A recorder. Kyle turned toward her. You've been recording us? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. You've been talking a lot. Kyle stared at the device. The red light blinked again. Then he looked back at her. His smile was gone now. You think this scares me? Eleanor's voice stayed calm. No. Kyle stepped closer. You think a little recorder changes anything? Derek held out his hand. Give it to me. Kyle passed the device over. Derek examined it. Professional grade. Not cheap. That was the first thing he noticed. The second thing was worse. There was a small logo on the side. A department logo. Derek felt his chest tighten. He turned the device in his hand again. Then he slowly looked up at Eleanor. You want to explain something? Eleanor folded her hands gently. There's nothing complicated. Kyle laughed. Oh, I think there is. Derek pointed the recorder slightly toward her. Why would an old lady have police equipment? The room went silent again. Eleanor looked from Derek to Kyle. Then she sighed. Not scared, not nervous, just tired. You boys really should have done better research. Kyle frowned. What does that mean? Eleanor reached down slowly. Derek instantly tensed. Don't move, he snapped. Eleanor froze. Her voice stayed calm. I'm just adjusting my sleeve. Kyle shook his head. No sudden movements. Eleanor nodded. Of course. Derek's mind was racing now. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. Very wrong. Kyle still looked confused. You planted a recorder? He asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. You planted yourselves. Kyle scoffed. That doesn't even make sense. Derek stared at her harder. You set us up? Eleanor didn't answer. Kyle laughed loudly. Oh, come on. He pointed around the room. You live here alone. You let us walk in. You're standing here like some sweet old grandma. Eleanor said quietly. That part wasn't difficult. Kyle's smile faded. What's that supposed to mean? Derek's eyes moved slowly around the house. Something clicked in his mind. Where's your husband? He asked suddenly. Eleanor blinked. My husband? You said he passed away. That's correct. Derek nodded slowly. And you live here alone? Yes. Derek stepped toward the window. He looked outside. The street was quiet, but something bothered him. He leaned closer to the glass. A black SUV sat 2 houses down, engine running. He turned back toward Eleanor. Who else knows we're here? Kyle scoffed. Dude, stop. But Derek didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Eleanor. Who else knows? He repeated. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Kyle grew impatient. Answer the question. Eleanor looked down at the recorder in Derek's hand, then back at him. You really should have researched your target. Kyle's voice rose. What target? Eleanor's tone didn't change. You've been running the scam for months. Kyle froze. Derek's stomach dropped. Eleanor continued. 8 confirmed victims. Kyle looked at Derek. Is she bluffing? Eleanor kept speaking. 3 in this neighborhood alone. Derek's grip on the recorder tightened. How do you know that? Eleanor gave a small smile. Because I've been following you. The room went silent. Kyle shook his head. That's impossible. Eleanor looked directly at him. Is it? Derek suddenly heard something outside. Very faint. A car door closing. Then another. His chest tightened. Kyle hadn't noticed yet. But Derek had. He turned slowly toward the front door. And that was when he heard it. Footsteps on the porch. More than one. Heavy boots. Kyle whispered, Derek? Then a loud voice came through the door. Police! Open the door! Kyle's face drained the color. Eleanor folded her hands calmly and waited. Police! Open the door! The shout shook the house. Kyle froze. Derek didn't move. For one long second, nobody breathed. Then Kyle spun toward Eleanor. You called them. Eleanor's voice stayed soft. I didn't have to. Derek grabbed the recorder tighter. His eyes moved quickly around the room. Front door. Windows. Back hallway. Too late. Kyle stepped closer to Eleanor. You set us up. Eleanor said nothing. Another heavy knock hit the door. Police. Open the door now. Kyle's voice dropped to a whisper. What do we do? Derek spoke quietly. Think. Kyle shook his head. There's nothing to think about. He pointed at Eleanor. She called them. Eleanor watched them both carefully. Derek took a slow breath. His brain was racing. How long? He asked suddenly. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. How long what? How long have you been watching us? Eleanor didn't answer right away. Kyle snapped. Answer him. Eleanor finally spoke. Long enough. Kyle cursed under his breath. Derek looked toward the window again. More movement outside now. Shadows passing. Boots on gravel. Kyle whispered quickly, We need to leave. Derek shook his head. Too many cops. Kyle's panic grew. They'll arrest us. Derek looked at him. They already will. Another loud knock. Last warning. Open the door. Kyle's voice cracked slightly. What if we say she invited us? Derek looked at him flatly. With the recorder running? Kyle swallowed. Derek turned back to Eleanor. You're not just some old lady. Eleanor gave a small smile. No. Kyle looked between them. Who are you? Eleanor didn't answer. Derek studied her face again. Now the calm made sense. Too calm. Too controlled. You're law enforcement. Eleanor's expression stayed neutral. Kyle laughed nervously. No way. Derek ignored him. You baited us. Kyle stared. What? Derek nodded slowly. You let us walk into this. Eleanor said quietly, you walked in by yourselves. Kyle's voice rose again. This is insane. Derek spoke sharply. Shut up. Kyle glared at him. Don't tell me to shut up. Derek stepped closer. Panicking won't help. Kyle rubbed his face with both hands. You said this job was safe. Derek shot back. It was supposed to be. Eleanor watched the argument silently. Kyle suddenly turned back to her. You tricked us. Eleanor's tone didn't change. You tricked your victims. Kyle stepped closer. You think you're better than us? Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. Yes. The answer was immediate. Kyle clenched his fists. You're just another thief. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. A thief? Yeah. Kyle pointed toward the recorder. You trick people too. Eleanor shook her head slightly. I stop people who prey on the vulnerable. Kyle scoffed. Same thing. Another loud voice outside. We are entering. Derek's pulse jumped. Kyle whispered urgently. We're out of time. Derek nodded. Yeah. Kyle looked toward the back hallway. Back door. Derek shook his head. Covered. Kyle's breathing got heavier. What about a window? Derek didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at Eleanor. Carefully. You've been watching us, he said slowly. Yes. For how long? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. 3 months. Kyle's eyes widened. 3 months. Derek felt his stomach drop. Why? Eleanor answered simply. You were sloppy. Kyle snapped. We were careful. Eleanor looked at him. Careful criminals don't brag. Kyle fell silent. Derek's mind replayed everything they had said. Every word. Every confession. The recorder was still in his hand. Still blinking. Kyle noticed it again. His eyes widened. You got everything? Eleanor didn't answer. That was answer enough. Kyle stepped back slowly. Oh no. Derek stared at the device. Yeah. Kyle whispered, we're screwed. Outside, metal clanked. Someone was unlocking something. Kyle's voice dropped to a whisper. What if we destroy it? Derek shook his head. Too late. Kyle looked at Eleanor again. You ruined our lives. Eleanor's voice was calm. You ruined your own. Kyle's anger flared again. You think you've won? Eleanor didn't respond. Instead, she reached slowly into her sweater pocket. Derek instantly tense again. Don't move. Eleanor paused. I'm not reaching for a weapon. Kyle snapped. Then what? Eleanor pulled out something small. A leather wallet. She opened it calmly. Inside was a badge. Official. Clear. Unmistakable. Derek felt the blood drain from his face. Eleanor held the badge up. Her voice stayed steady. Detective Eleanor Whitaker. Kyle whispered, No way. Eleanor finished calmly. Financial Crimes Division. Outside the door. Metal smashed against the lock. The door burst open. Police. Don't move. The front door burst open. Wood cracked. The lock snapped loose. Police. Don't move. Heavy boots rushed into the house. 3 officers flooded the living room. Weapons raised. Hands where we can see them. Kyle froze instantly. Derek slowly lifted his hands. The recorder dropped from his fingers and hit the floor. An officer kicked it aside. Step away from her. Kyle stumbled backward. We didn't. On the ground. Another officer pointed toward the carpet. Now. Kyle dropped first. Face down. Hands spread. Derek followed slowly, his mind still spinning. 2 officers moved quickly. Handcuffs snapped tight around Kyle's wrists. Metal clicked around Derek's wrists a second later. Clear, one officer called out. Another officer stepped toward Eleanor. Detective Whitaker, you all right? Eleanor nodded. I'm fine. Kyle lifted his head slightly. His voice shook. Detective? Derek looked up too. Confusion, shock, fear. Eleanor adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan calmly. Yes. Kyle's breathing became uneven. You're not 80. Eleanor almost smiled. I never said I was. One officer helped her step aside from the two men. Another officer picked up the recorder. Still running. Eleanor nodded. Good. Kyle stared at the floor. You tricked us. Eleanor looked down at him. You tricked seniors out of their savings. Kyle whispered. That's different. An officer behind him scoffed. No, it isn't. Derek finally spoke again. His voice was quieter now. How long? Eleanor looked at him. You already asked that. 3 months, Derek said slowly. She nodded. Yes. Kyle turned his head. You watched us for 3 months? Yes. Why didn't you arrest us before? Eleanor's answer was simple. Evidence. Kyle swallowed. All the houses. Yes. All the victims. Yes. Derek closed his eyes briefly. The weight of it hit him. Every word they had said, every confession, recorded. Kyle looked around the room desperately. You can't prove anything. One of the officers laughed quietly. Really? He pointed toward the recorder. That thing has been collecting proof for months. Kyle shook his head. You can't use that. Eleanor spoke calmly. It's already been logged as evidence. Derek looked up at her again. You planned this. Yes. Kyle stared at her in disbelief. You pretended to be weak. Eleanor didn't react. You pretended to be helpless. Eleanor spoke quietly. You saw what you wanted to see. Kyle had no answer. An officer pulled Derek to his feet. Stand up. Derek stood slowly. Kyle was lifted next. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back. He looked around the house again. The small living room, the quiet furniture, the grocery bag still sitting on the table. Bread, milk, tea. He laughed bitterly. All this just to catch us? Eleanor shook her head. No. Kyle frowned. Then what? To protect people you thought didn't matter. Kyle looked away. Derek spoke again. 8 victims. Eleanor nodded. Confirmed. Derek's voice dropped. How much did they lose? Eleanor answered without emotion. Over $90,000. Kyle's eyes widened. 90? Eleanor looked at him. Some of them lost their life savings. Kyle's face went pale. An officer stepped forward. Time to go. Kyle panicked. Wait. The officer didn't stop. You can talk to your lawyer. Derek looked at Eleanor one last time. You knew exactly how we'd approach you. Yes. You let us think we were in control. Yes. Kyle whispered. You baited us. Eleanor's voice stayed calm. You chose a trap. The officers began leading them toward the door. Kyle twisted slightly. You ruined everything. Eleanor watched them go. You ruined at the moment you knocked on someone's door pretending to help. Kyle had no reply. Outside, police cars lined the quiet street. Red and blue lights flashed across the neighborhood houses. Neighbors watched from their windows. Kyle and Derek were led down the front steps. One officer read their rights. The cold metal doors of the patrol car opened. Before Derek was pushed inside, he turned back toward the house. Eleanor stood in the doorway, calm, still, watching. And for the first time since the entire ordeal began, Derek realized something. She had never been the victim, not for one single second. The patrol car doors slammed shut. Kyle sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, breathing fast. Derek sat beside him, silent. The flashing lights from the police cruisers painted the street red and blue. Neighbors stood along their fences, watching, whispering. Kyle leaned forward slightly. This isn't real, he muttered. Derek didn't respond. A police officer shut the door firmly. Stay put. Kyle laughed nervously, like we have a choice. Across the yard, Eleanor stepped down from the porch. Another officer walked beside her, Detective Harris. Tall, calm, watching everything. You did good, Harris said. Eleanor adjusted her cardigan. They walked right into it. Harris nodded. They always do. Kyle watched them through the car window. That's a detective? He whispered. Derek nodded slowly. Yeah. Kyle shook his head. She looks like somebody's grandma. Derek gave a hollow laugh. That was the point. Two more officers carried boxes out of the house. Evidence bags. Documents. The recorder. Kyle watched the recorder carefully as it passed by. That thing ruined us, he said quietly. Derek stared straight ahead. No. Kyle frowned. What do you mean, no? Derek finally looked at him. We ruined ourselves. Kyle had no answer. Outside the car, Detective Harris spoke quietly with Eleanor. We've been waiting months for this. Eleanor nodded. They were careful at first, but they got confident. Harris smiled faintly. Criminals always do. Eleanor looked toward the patrol car. Kyle and Derek sat inside, defeated. Did we confirm the other victims? She asked. Harris nodded. All 8. Eleanor sighed. 8 families. Harris opened a small folder. Actually 10. Eleanor looked up. 10. 2 more came forward last week. Her eyes narrowed. How much did they lose? Harris flipped through the pages. Combined? Eleanor waited. Harris answered quietly. $112,000. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Kyle watched from the car. What are they talking about? He asked. Derek didn't answer. Kyle kept talking. They can't prove all that. Derek shook his head slowly. Yes, they can. Kyle frowned. How? Derek nodded toward the evidence boxes, bank transfers, recorded conversations, victim statements. Kyle swallowed. Then why didn't they arrest us before? Derek answered quietly. They were building a case. Kyle leaned back in the seat. Against everything we've done. Across the yard, Harris spoke again. You know the DA is going to love this. Eleanor gave a small smile. Clean case. Very clean. Harris nodded toward the patrol car. Those 2 confessed to half of it already. Eleanor chuckled softly. People talk when they think they're winning. Harris closed the folder. You played the role perfectly. Eleanor shrugged. They underestimated the role. Harris looked toward the quiet neighborhood street. That's the ugly part. What? They chose their victims carefully. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Older people. People living alone. People they thought nobody would believe. Harris sighed. They've been doing it for years. Eleanor's voice dropped. That's why this case matters. Back in the patrol car, Kyle looked at Derek again. You think we can fight it? Derek didn't respond. Kyle nudged him. Come on. Derek spoke quietly. Fight what? Kyle's voice rose. The charges. Derek finally looked at him. You heard the detective. Kyle frowned. What? 10 victims. Kyle blinked. 10. Derek nodded. And counting. Kyle's face went pale. Outside, an officer approached the patrol car, ready to transport. Harris nodded. Take them in. The officer opened the rear door. All right, gentlemen. Kyle tried to sound confident. This is a mistake. The officer didn't react. Step out. Kyle climbed out slowly. Derek followed. Their cuffs stayed tight. Neighbors watched from the sidewalk now. Phones out. Recording. Kyle whispered angrily. They're filming us. Derek didn't care anymore. 2 officers walked them towards separate patrol cars. Kyle twisted slightly. This isn't over. No one responded. Derek paused near the car door. He looked back toward the house one last time. Eleanor stood near the porch again, calm, watching. Kyle shouted across the yard. You tricked us. Eleanor's voice carried back across the street. No. Kyle sneered. Yeah, you did. Eleanor shook her head slowly. You tricked yourselves. Kyle didn't understand, but Derek did. Eleanor added quietly. You thought the world belonged to you. Derek looked down. And tonight, she finished, the world answered back. The patrol car door slammed shut, and the convoy of flashing lights began moving down the quiet street. The police station felt colder than the night outside. Bright white lights, gray walls, the sound of distant phones ringing. Kyle sat alone in a small interview room. His hands were still cuffed to the metal ring on the table. He stared at the wall. His leg bounced nervously. The door opened. Detective Harris walked in, a folder in his hand. Kyle looked up quickly. "You gonna tell me what this is really about?" Harris sat down slowly. "This?" Kyle nodded. "Yeah." Harris opened the folder. "It's about fraud." Kyle scoffed. "Fraud." Harris flipped a page. "Wire fraud." Another page. "Identity fraud." Another. "Elder financial exploitation." Kyle's jaw tightened. "That sounds dramatic." Harris leaned back in the chair. "It is dramatic." Kyle shrugged. "We never hurt anybody." Harris raised an eyebrow. "No." Kyle shook his head. "We just took some money." Harris slid a photo across the table. Kyle looked down. An elderly man sat in the picture, thin, worried. "What's this?" Kyle asked. "That's Mr. Leonard Brooks." Kyle didn't recognize the name. "So," Harris spoke quietly, "you took $20,000 from him." Kyle blinked. "I didn't." Harris tapped the photo. That was his retirement savings. Kyle looked away. Harris slid another photo forward. An elderly woman this time, crying. "That's Mrs. Helen Porter." Kyle swallowed. "You told her the power company would shut off her electricity." Kyle didn't answer. "She paid you $8,000. Kyle stared at the table. Harris spoke again. "She was saving that money for medical treatment." The room went quiet. Kyle's voice came out weaker now. "We didn't know that." Harris closed the folder slowly. "That's the problem." Kyle looked up. "You didn't care." Kyle stayed silent. Across the hall, Derek sat in another interview room. Detective Eleanor Whitaker sat across from him. The badge was no longer hidden. Her posture was different now. Professional. Controlled. Derek studied her. "You really watched this for 3 months." Eleanor nodded. "Yes." "Why me?" "You were the organizer." Derek frowned. "How do you know that?" Eleanor opened a folder. Inside were printed photos. Surveillance images. Kyle and Derek knocking on doors. Meeting in parking lots. Entering houses. Derek leaned back slowly. "You had all this?" Eleanor nodded. "And more." Derek shook his head. "You could have stopped us earlier." Eleanor answered calmly. "Stopping you once doesn't stop the system." Derek looked confused. "What system?" "The one that targets vulnerable people." Derek looked down at the table. Eleanor continued. "You weren't just 2 scammers." Derek said nothing. "You were part of a pattern." Derek rubbed his forehead. "So what happens now?" Eleanor answered simply. "You go to court." Derek laughed quietly. "And prison?" "Most likely." Derek looked up again. "You seem calm about that." Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "I've seen the damage these crimes cause." Derek hesitated. "Those victims." Eleanor nodded. "They trusted you." Derek didn't argue. Eleanor continued. "One of them lost everything." Derek looked up. "What do you mean everything?" Eleanor spoke quietly. "Her house." Derek froze. "She used her mortgage to pay you." The words hung in the room. Derek stared at the table. "I didn't know." Eleanor answered calmly. "You didn't ask." Down the hallway, Kyle was being escorted out of the interview room. 2 officers held his arms. He looked angry again. "You can't prove all of this." One officer responded flatly. "We already did." Kyle shouted, "This is harassment." The officer opened the holding cell door. "Inside." Kyle hesitated, then stepped inside. The metal door slammed shut behind him. Across the hallway, Derek was escorted out too. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply walked. As he passed Eleanor, he paused. "You really fooled us." Eleanor didn't smile. "You fooled yourselves." Derek nodded slowly. He stepped into the cell. The door shut. The lock clicked. And for the first time since the scam began, the game was truly over. The courtroom was quiet, with benches, soft whispers, the sound of papers moving. Kyle sat at the defense table, a dark suit that didn't quite fit, his hands folded tightly together. Derek sat beside him, silent. Across the room, 10 elderly people filled the front row. Victims. Some sat with family members. Some sat alone. Kyle avoided looking at them. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Be seated. The room settled again. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, the state calls Detective Eleanor Whitaker. Eleanor walked to the witness stand. Her steps were steady. Calm. She raised her hand. I swear to tell the truth. The prosecutor nodded. Detective Whitaker, can you explain your role in this investigation? Eleanor spoke clearly. I work in the Financial Crimes Division. How long did this investigation last? 3 months. What were you investigating? A fraud scheme targeting elderly homeowners. The prosecutor gestured toward the defense table. Do you see the individuals involved in that scheme? Eleanor looked directly at Kyle and Derek. Yes. Can you identify them? The man in the gray suit is Derek Lawson. And beside him, Kyle Bennett. The prosecutor nodded. Can you explain how they operated? Eleanor folded her hands calmly. They impersonated utility workers. What did they tell their victims? That there was a billing error. And then they claimed the victims owed money or needed to verify financial information. The prosecutor glanced toward the jury. What happened next? They pressured victims into giving cash. How many confirmed victims? 10. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor continued. How much money was stolen? Over $100,000. Kyle shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something to him. Eleanor continued speaking. 1 victim lost her home. The room grew even quieter. The prosecutor nodded. Can you explain how the defendants were arrested? Eleanor spoke simply. I worked undercover. Kyle shook his head slowly. His lawyer leaned closer. Stay quiet. The prosecutor continued. Where did you meet the defendants? At a grocery store parking lot. And what happened? They approached me. Why? They believe I was vulnerable. The prosecutor paused. What made them believe that? Eleanor answered calmly. My appearance. The prosecutor nodded. And what happened when they entered your home? They attempted to intimidate me. How? They demanded money. The prosecutor raised a small evidence bag. Inside was a recording device. Is this familiar? Eleanor nodded. Yes. What is it? A recording device. What did it capture? The defendants admitting their crimes. The prosecutor placed the device on the table. No further questions. The defense attorney stood slowly. Detective Whitaker. Yes, you deceived my clients. Eleanor remained calm. I conducted an undercover investigation. You pretended to be elderly. I allowed them to believe it. You manipulated them. Eleanor looked directly at him. They manipulated their victims. The defense attorney frowned. But you recorded them without warning. Yes, that's deceptive. Eleanor answered quietly. So, is pretending to be a utility worker? A few people in the courtroom murmured. The defense attorney paused. Then he sighed. No further questions. The judge looked toward the jury. Members of the jury had been listening closely. Some glanced toward the victims in the front row. Others looked toward Kyle and Derek. The judge spoke calmly. You may step down, detective. Eleanor returned to her seat. The prosecutor stood again. Your Honor, the state rests. The defense attorney looked toward Kyle and Derek. They exchanged a brief look. Then the attorney sighed. Your Honor, he paused. The defense also rests. The courtroom waited. The judge adjusted his glasses. He looked at the jury. Members of the jury, you have heard the evidence. You will now decide. Kyle stared at the floor. Derek closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, the victim sat quietly, watching, waiting for justice. The courtroom was silent. The jury had been gone for almost 2 hours. No one spoke. Kyle sat rigid in his chair. His fingers tapped the table again and again. Derek sat beside him, still, almost calm now. Across the room, the victims remained in the front row. Mr. Brooks sat with his daughter. Mrs. Porter held a tissue in her hands. Another elderly couple sat together, fingers tightly intertwined, waiting. The courtroom doors opened. The jury returned. Everyone stood. The judge nodded. Be seated. The foreperson stepped forward. The judge asked a question. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. Kyle swallowed. Derek didn't move. The courtroom held its breath. The foreperson unfolded the paper. On the charge of wire fraud, Kyle's jaw tightened. We find the defendant Derek Lawson. A pause. Guilty. A quiet wave moved through the room. The foreperson continued. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant Kyle Bennett. Another pause. Guilty. Kyle lowered his head. The foreperson kept reading. On the charge of financial exploitation of the elderly. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy. Guilty. Each word landed like a hammer. Derek closed his eyes. Kyle stared straight ahead. The foreperson finished. The judge nodded. The court thanks the jury for its service. The jurors stepped down. The judge looked toward the two men. Mr. Lawson, Mr. Bennett, you exploited trust. You targeted people you believed were powerless. Kyle said nothing. Derek didn't look up. The judge continued. You stole life savings. You threatened stability. You caused lasting harm. He paused, then delivered the sentence. This court sentences each of you to 12 years in federal prison. A quiet gasp moved through the courtroom. Kyle finally looked up. 12 years. The judge didn't respond. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. The room slowly began to move again. Officers stepped toward Kyle and Derek. Handcuffs returned to their wrists. Kyle whispered to Derek, "This can't be real." Derek spoke quietly. "It is." They were led toward the exit. As Kyle passed the victim row, he glanced at the elderly faces. For the first time, he looked ashamed. Across the room, Eleanor stood near the back wall, watching quietly. Detective Harris stepped beside her. "Case closed." Eleanor nodded. "For them." Harris glanced toward the victims. Mr. Brooks hugged his daughter. Mrs. Porter wiped tears from her face. "Not for them," Harris said. Eleanor knew he was right. Justice didn't erase what had happened. Money lost, trust broken, fear left behind. She walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom. Mrs. Porter looked up as Eleanor approached. "You're the detective," she said softly. Eleanor nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Porter held her hands tightly together. "Thank you." Eleanor gave a small smile. "You deserve justice." Mrs. Porter shook her head slightly. "No." Her voice trembled. "We deserve protection." The word stayed with Eleanor. After the courtroom emptied, Eleanor stepped outside. The afternoon sky was clear. Quiet. Harris joined her again. "You all right?" Eleanor nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" Eleanor looked across the courthouse steps. About how easy it was for them. Harris didn't respond. Eleanor continued. "They saw older people and assumed weakness." Harris sighed. "That happened a lot." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes." She looked back toward the courthouse doors. "But sometimes the world pushes back." Harris smiled slightly. "And sometimes the sweet old lady wins." Eleanor adjusted her cardigan, a habit she had kept even after the case ended. Then she walked down the courthouse steps, into the quiet afternoon. And somewhere out there, another scammer would knock on another door, looking for someone weak, someone easy, someone powerless. But tonight, two of them had learned the truth. The sweet old lady had never been the victim, not for one single second.